Good evening and welcome to News from Neptune for the 25th week of 2017. I'm Carl Estabrook. For more than a quarter century, this program has been a weekly hour of spontaneous and unrehearsed discussion of the news of the week and its coverage by the media, first on a so-called community radio station and now via Urbana Public Television and YouTube. Our program's name, News from Neptune, comes from Noam Chomsky, who's been running sensible things about U.S. politics for half a century. Chomsky says in the U.S. media, either you repeat the same conventional doctrines everybody is saying, or else you say something true and it will sound like it's from Neptune. Tonight, David Green and I will try to say some true things on a dirty laundry list edition of News from Neptune. We've been off the air for a while, and the laundry's been piling up, particularly the dirty laundry. And David, I think, has a list to begin with.
It hasn't been piling up. We have to go all the way back to Max Blumenthal's, who did a good sort of hit interview on a fellow named Jamie Raskin, and exposed him to be the kind of silly anti-Putin Dem tool. Jamie Raskin is the great Dem hope. He's a U.S. congressperson from Maryland now, who was recently elected, and it was pretty shocking what he had to say on a brief interview that Max did with him on the Real News Network. And then related to that, of course, you've got the recent debacle in Georgia, with John Ossoff getting beaten, the sort of Clinton light candidate getting beaten by the Republican candidate this past Tuesday. And that's been commented on, including by Jeffrey St. Clair this morning on his column. Carl, as you know, we both had a letter on the same day in the News Gazette in response to a column by a local faculty person, Sundiata Chajua, who has a column dealing with black perspective every other Sunday in the local paper. And he wrote a couple of weeks ago about white rage, about this woman who's been going around, Carol Anderson has been going around, talking about white rage, who I'd heard a couple of interviews with and was pretty critical of, and was even more critical after reading Sundiata's column. And I think it's worth noting that I think we both made cogent critiques of the white rage perspective, and that there has been absolutely no response from anyone that I know of to those critiques. I don't know whether people are accepting what we had to say, or just think, well, who are these white guys writing letters, or have they got white rage too, or I don't know. But I tried to be as pardon for the self-flattery, but I tried to be as measured and cogent and analytical as I could possibly be. And I think you made a pretty good argument that understanding the phenomenon of white rage isn't a very helpful, and in fact it's a distraction in understanding the current plight that we're in right now. Thomas Edsall in the New York Times has also distracted us from understanding the class basis of our politics by, unbelievably, in his column the other day, comparing the Corbyn victory in Britain, quote unquote victory, the Labour Party progress in the UK, to the Macron victory in France. Because it's globalization. It's not class versus class. It's globalization versus nationalism, which is, again, not a way to understand the way the world works. And Thomas Edsall, we think he should know better, but he writes for the New York Times, and they're trying to, generally speaking, to put forward this idea that we can't talk about social class. Charles Krauthammer, okay.
Yes. Mm-hmm.
Well, anyway, Sunnis versus Shia, the moderate Saudi Arabians in the paper this morning, the moderate Saudi Arabians. Venezuela, coverage of people like Matt Taibbi referring to the government of Venezuela as a dictatorship. positive note, single payer in California is making some progress.
Yes.
Single payer health care. Might as well note that. There was the two things along with the Corbyn victory in UK that were positive things that sort of happened in the last 3 weeks since we've been on, and then also a nice interview on the Real News Network about, we talk more about Syria, which is obviously a serious issue right now in the broader context. A nice report on the Real News Network about Israel's involvement in Syria, what their interests are there, and what they're doing there, and how that fits into the larger scheme of things there. So that's my laundry list.
That's a list. I think
it's
I
not all dirty, but it's not exactly clean.
Yeah, exactly. I may pull a couple of things out of the laundry basket to talk about particularly there.
Yeah.
But I also generated a list,
Yeah.
and I have exactly a dozen donuts or a dozen do-nots or something on my list, to change the metaphor a bit, unless the donuts got thrown into the laundry for some reason. In any case, my granddaughters have been visiting, and such things were happening this week, which is probably why it's on my mind. But the dozen donuts I have start with the fact that Bahrain, Egypt, Saudi Arabia, and the United Arab Emirates have given Qatar a list of demands it must meet within 10 days in order to return to the four countries' good graces. Now, behind us, of course, is the American Middle East policy, which is always the evil genius in arrangements like this. But these are particularly striking in that the countries call upon Qatar to close down Al Jazeera. You can't be telling truth about what's going on around there, right? They accuse Qatar of fostering ties with Al-Qaeda and the Islamic State, and they condemn the association with Hezbollah, the Lebanese Shiite group. This leads off to the fantasy that you were talking about that we got from Charles Krauthammer today about Sunni Shia politics, and it will take more than the time we have today to sort out the mishigas here, but we need to do that. That's point one. Point two. Chinese President Xi Jinping is set to make his first official visit to Hong Kong to mark the 20th anniversary of the handover from Britain to China. I was privileged to be in Hong Kong for a while this spring, and very interested indeed in what's going on there and the changes that are taking place and how they relate to, in fact, American policy and this administration's policy in the Far East. We need to talk about that. 3, Seth Rich. The people who had the most to gain from his death and the most to lose if he lived, the Clinton campaign and the Democratic National Committee, are busily telling us that they could not possibly have been involved in his death, and all the media grandees fall in with that, and it's conspiracy thinking to think that that's possible. That's something we should be talking about. 4, the U.S. military is attacking the Syrian army precisely because it was defeating ISIS and other jihadist forces and regaining its own territory and control of its border with Iraq. The U.S. does not want that to happen. And so we're killing people in Syria. 5, the Pentagon said 1 civilian died in a drone strike on the Syrian mosque in Mosul. In fact, they killed dozens, and the death toll has been horrendous, and the account is somehow, strangely, not equivalent to the stories we got about Aleppo. 6, the U.S. is interrogating detainees, and that's as even the Washington Post recognizes that is a euphemism for torture in Yemen. And the whole story of torture in the Obama administration and this administration has not been covered. And it takes some explanation to say why the Washington Post and the AP are now suddenly referring to what's been the case throughout the Middle East in the last administration and this one. We need to talk about that a little. 7, Bernie Sanders sent $100,000 to the Democratic National Committee in May. This is kiss and make up, right? All is forgiven, and Bernie will be around.
Of his own money? Of what? Of his campaign war chest?
His campaign war chest.
Okay.
Yeah, right. It's the best thing I've seen on this, by the way, is Glenn Ford on Black Agenda Report on the real politics of Bernie Sanders, particularly in regard to war, which is the issue finally at stake here. The good piece by Dennis Kucinich, we haven't heard from at least since he went to Syria with Tulsi Gabbard a while ago. That's important, I think. Dennis points out that the president has essentially appropriated the war-making powers granted to the federal government under the U.S. Constitution and turned them over to the generals who've been running the U.S. war in the Middle East all along anyhow. It's a complicated issue. It's the result of what's essentially an establishment coup against Trump, but Trump has acquiesced in the coup at least as much as Bernie has, and for Trump it may be a good deal more important because it will kill more people. Our colleague, number 9, our colleague Karen Aram has sent us a petition that you can find on the internet from the equivocal group changeback.org that points out quite accurately that U.S. intervention in Syria is illegal under international law. It violates the UN Charter. It's illegal under the U.S. Constitution. It's thoroughly immoral, murderous, disastrous, destabilizing, and will only generate more terrorism and massive human misery. It serves no legitimate national interest whatsoever. This is, once again, something that's not being talked about. Most Americans aren't aware even of the number of troops that the U.S. has, literally thousands, in the Middle East right now, and this illegal, across the board, war that the U.S. is carrying on in Syria. Number 10, the Georgia election. David, you mentioned the Georgia election, but I like William Kaufman's comment about the Georgia election and the state of the Democrats, as you pointed out. The euphoniously named Ossoff was defeated in the Atlanta district that Newt Gingrich used to represent, one of the richest congressional districts in the country, second only to the congressional district in which the Pentagon sits. There may be some connection. In any case, the election in Georgia, William Kaufman comments, the Democrats aren't feckless, inept, or stupid, unable to learn what it takes to win. They are corrupt. They do not want to win with an authentically progressive program because it would threaten the economic interests of their main corporate donor base. Parenthetically here, I might say a similar situation obtains in the state of Illinois that we've been talking about it in some places this week, but we may come back to the Illinois Democrats if we don't have anything more insignificant to talk about. But William Kaufman continues, if you're waiting for the Democrats to learn, you're waiting for Godot. I'm not sure that's a good use of Mr. Beckett, but still. The Democrats know exactly what they're doing. They have a business model, and that model is serving the interests of the corporate elite. That lesson they have learned to the exclusion of all others, so stop pleading with them to be nice and progressive. It's never going to happen. Close quote, William Kaufman, and I'm afraid he's right. My penultimate point is from Zero Hedge, another peculiar website that I recommend. They occasionally get things right, and that's a pretty good record as those things go. They point out that for defending Syria, for Russia's defense of Syria, the U.S. countered with a coup in Ukraine. The direct connection between the Obama administration's coup in Ukraine and the Putin administration's frustration of the Obama administration's attempt to overthrow the Syrian government is not often made, and that's where this comment begins. The condemnation of Putin, among other things, is for frustrating American plans in the Middle East. There's nothing like a demonized enemy to keep the $700 billion national security budget flowing, and the hideous warfare state opulence of the imperial city, Washington, D.C., intact. So why not throw in an allegedly stolen U.S. election to garnish the case? In a word, the little putsch in Kiev is now begetting a greater big coup in the imperial city in Washington. This needs to be unpacked, but it reminds me of the motto of the now completely mythical student organization of 2 generations ago, Students for a Democratic Society. The motto was, "Everything is connected." It's worthwhile to remember that motto when one talks about American foreign policy, and particularly Russiagate, one of the most astonishing events in American politics that I've seen in 50 years. So there's my laundry list. Can I throw in one more? Only because...
Why not?
Yeah, only because...
As long as it's only a dirty sock.
It's 2 socks, or at least 2 paragraphs.
Okay.
This is from Bill Engdahl, who writes interesting but peculiar things often about this. But he makes, I'm into these connections tonight, he makes the point, the downfall of American power began in August 1971, when President Nixon tore up the solemn Bretton Woods treaty obligations of the United States, that came from the end of the Second World War, and shut the Federal Reserve gold discount window. Since then, Wall Street money power has made a silent coup and transforming the United States that I knew as a young man in the 50s and 60s, this is Bill Engdahl, but it's also true of me, from a more or less functioning democratic republic into an oligarchy where money controls all, as even President Carter pointed out again last week, from presidents like Obama or Trump to congressmen who make the laws. That is a very dangerous state of affairs for Americans and for the entire world. Now the nations of Eurasia are building up a new world with huge investment in economic growth, investment in infrastructure, high-speed rail links, new deep-water ports, all connecting the peoples of all Eurasia from Beijing to Moscow to Bremen to Rotterdam to Tehran, perhaps to Istanbul and beyond. For more than the past 2 decades, all the U.S. has offered to the world is a foreign policy of wars and destruction of any and all threats to her power, to her failing hegemony. This is the important point. Now the world has a chance for the first time in several centuries to build up and develop our civilization in truly positive ways. It's our choice which alternative we take. That's Bill Engdahl, and I think there is more than a grain of wisdom in that. But you're listening to News from Neptune. We have 2 laundry lists here, and I must admit the dirty clothes are piling up immensely. David, pull one out and shake it out for us.
I guess to start with something relatively trivial, I suppose that the Dems can argue that in a district that was represented by Newt Gingrich, there really wasn't that much chance anyway, and that they did pretty well to lose only by 3 percentage points, when in fact Trump won in that district by like 23 percentage points, and that it probably wouldn't have made, they could argue perhaps convincingly, that it probably wouldn't have made any difference if you had a more straightforwardly progressive, quote unquote, or leftist candidate, someone who didn't reject single-payer health care, or someone who actually criticized U.S. foreign policy. But the point isn't whether it would have worked or not. The point is that that's what you got to try. That's what you got to do if the Democratic Party is to have any future other than just sort of sharing power under the sort of neoliberal auspices with the Republican Party, winning a few, losing a few, and always getting the same people. And that's why people should be dissatisfied, not just because he lost. He might have lost anyway. I might have lost. You might have lost.
We've both done that.
Yeah, we're both used to losing. But still, the point is fecklessness, a word you like to use, of the whole issue.
There's a lot of it going around.
Now I like to use it. Okay.
It turns up a lot, I'm afraid.
I need to get my own words, but I'll borrow one from you.
The situation in the is 11th district? No, I remember. I don't remember.
Yeah, I don't remember the number.
Suburban district of Atlanta in Georgia, where there was a special election this week. I've heard different numbers on that. At least one attack on the accounts of the percentages that both Trump and the Democrats had in that district. It's not quite clear to me what's happening. The one number that has come across in the news reports is the immense amount of money spent. It is being gleefully called the most expensive congressional race in history. May be true. It's a rich community. Both parties spent a great deal of money there. But I think the real issue is the media account of the tremendous national dismay with the Trump administration is not borne out by the relationship here. Even the national media recognized that this had a certain referendum quality to it, a referendum about the administration right now. The notion being that people are so appalled at the current administration that naturally they'll vote against it and vote against a Clinton Democrat, which, as you say, was running. That didn't happen.
Or vote? You mean vote for a Clinton Democrat, or vote?
We'll vote against Trump by voting for a Clinton Democrat.
Right.
Yeah. And in that sense, the election was a bellwether of political opinion in the country, particularly if you've been listening to the national media that tells you how everybody hates Trump because he's so inept as a president. He isn't doing what earlier presidents have done, or if he's doing it with an ill grace, and he's not busily killing people in the Mideast the way the Obama administration did, and therefore he obviously has to be rejected on the hustings. Well, that didn't happen for whatever reason, and the outrage against Trump that was supposed to elect Mr. Ossoff didn't occur.
Right. And it shouldn't have occurred.
But still, it shows something about the mood in the country. That's the issue.
Right. And again, it's just, the point is to run an honest candidate, to run a truthful candidate, and if people are, every district will be different in terms of how that person resonates with their district. I mean, that it would be a better test case if a candidate like that ran in a more working class district. Montana was in a similar situation a couple weeks ago, and their Republican didn't lose even though he punched a reporter, and even though he committed a basically felonious act in public during his campaign. And that's probably a very similar story in terms of I get the idea that his opponent was a little more decent than Ossoff in Georgia, but anyway.
But the issue about what that reveals about the national mood, I mean, I think this actually fits into that great arc of political results going back to Brexit and the campaign, the Sanders and Trump campaigns, and the fell specter of what the media call populism. Populism being the rejection by the electorate of what the political parties in this country, in Britain and France and elsewhere, think is good for people. And how can they be so obtuse, probably because they're racist, as not to vote for the good things that are being presented by the political parties? Well, it's an issue. They're onto something. There is a populist mood about, however much you deplore it, and it is producing results, sometimes not overwhelming results, but it is occurring, and the populace is showing itself quite restless. It has reason to be. The policies of the national governments, neoliberal and neoconservative as they are, depend upon, essentially, the immiseration of the populace. And after more than a generation, people begin to notice. And people begin to vote in ways that are not coordinate with the very nice candidates the parties have picked out for them.
And I think, appropriate segue would be back to the Macron-Corbyn issue that Thomas Edsall was trying to finesse in his social class clueless way. I mean, I don't know. Are people like that conscious of the fact that they're simply denying the role of social class in these elections? He acted as if in that article as if their rejection of the French Socialist Party, which became a neoliberal party
Right.
for the last several years under Hollande's government, that they lost not because they were a socialist party, but they became a nothing party. They essentially went down to like 5 seats,
Right.
because the French decided they would vote the leftist French, the truly leftist French, the socialist French. They decided they would vote for the real socialist candidate, Mélenchon, and in the last election. Edsall just ignores all this by comparing Macron, unbelievably, to Corbyn, who, again, if you compare like Ossoff to Corbyn, it's like you could say, well, Corbyn, the Labour Party didn't win, but they did so much better that the fact that the British Prime Minister May called this election because she thought that they were gonna clean up, but the British woke up and responded again to this honest message, honest, truthful. You have to be honest and truthful. You can't just be honest, because you could be honest and wrong. But honest and truthful message that Corbyn was saying, and the Labour Party came back to the point where now the Tories have to form a government with with the right wing sort of fundamentalist Irish what do they call the
DUP, the Democratic Unionist Party,
Unionist Party of Ireland,
which looks like falling apart. Yeah.
I had never even heard of before. Well, I never really, because they never really had much of a role in sort of swinging governments. But now they're
I think they were spoken of under a different name. I spoke of the loyalists in Northern Ireland, and that's who you meant.
I mean, I know about those people. Right. I know about Ian Paisley and the whole gang. But
interesting thing that seems to be happening over the weekend, though, is that the DUP, the Democratic Unionist Party, essentially the Protestant party, where Protestant has less to do with theology and much more to do with the identification of communities. The DUP is driving a hard bargain against the Tories, and it's not clear that the arrangement is going to work. And if the arrangement doesn't work, in other words, if the Tories don't get the DUP support, the limited support even that the DUP offered in the Parliament, it's not out of the question that Jeremy Corbyn could become Prime Minister. So we may be on this program in a week or two talking about the new British Prime Minister, and if so, that could be very interesting indeed. Because once again, we're talking about these electoral results that defy the conventional wisdom and produce these populist enthusiasms, which I take to be generally quite positive, whether we're talking about Mélenchon and the extreme left, as they say in France, or Marine Le Pen and the extreme right, as the conventional wisdom has it in France. I posted a thing about a member of the French Assembly elected from Calais in this week's election. An interesting man who has been involved in politics for a long time. I think he must be about my age. His family was an active anti-Nazi support for the resistance during the war. He became a communist after the war, worked very hard in politics in northern France for the vigorous French Communist Party, greatly feared by the United States and opposed by the United States overtly and covertly. And this man, in his 70s, ran as a Le Pen delegate for the French National Assembly. He's not alone. He's not an exception. There are a good number of those, and as David was suggesting a moment ago, the failure in some ways for the Mélenchon and Le Pen voters to get together meant that the populist challenge, which they both represent versions of, was defeated by Macron, who is a thoroughly neoliberal president. But even he is showing some interesting peculiarities. He said this week that there wasn't any obvious successor to Assad in Syria, and therefore France, who'd been a vigorous proponent of American regime change in Syria, wasn't going to go down that road anymore. Interesting and important, and a suggestion of an overall theme, I must say, that seemed to me to be even more important this week in terms of a burgeoning realization, and that is that the U.S. relative decline in the political affairs of the world proceeds apace. It continues. We forget sometimes that the worldwide economic hegemony that the U.S. established after the Second World War reached a high point then. And that in many ways, if you talk about the history of the world since 1945, you're talking about the relative decline of the United States in relationship, obviously, to the other powers as they rebuilt and so forth after the Second World War. But that relative decline hasn't ceased. And that's what's worrying them in Washington. That's why in Washington there's such a push to kill people. U.S. presidents have killed between 20 and 30 million people since the Second World War, and that's in aid of maintaining the disparity, as George Kennan said after the war, the disparity between the control that the U.S. exercised over the world economy and the attempt of the rest of the world to rebuild its own post-war economy. And it seems to me that that's what we're living in the midst of right now, and that is the fundamental explanation for the mad opposition to Russia and China that we see in the American political establishment. The final note being that the peculiarities of the Trump administration begin when Trump looked like violating those principles. Now, it seems he's been brought back into line, and that the American political establishment continues to kill people to stave off its relative political decline. But it seems to me that all the stories we've talked about tonight have this as the underlying frame, Washington policy that is increasingly hysterical about losing its once completely dominant position.
Let me just finish off, not to beat this dead horse, but just to beat it one more time. Since I went to the trouble of actually writing down a quote from the Edsel article, the manner in which he's eliding the notion of a class-based left is by referring to it as the affluent left. Okay, and the reason why I emphasize Thomas Edsel is he is the person, probably the one person now, as much as anyone, even Thomas Friedman, who is really shaping the way that we view our political alignments in the paper of record, the New York Times. So the notion that the world that we've got these nationalists and populists on one side and these globalist affluent left on the other side is really it really indicates how desperate that elites are to shape the political spectrum in a way to their liking, to exclude what might be called the genuine populist, egalitarian, dare say, socialist left that might have been represented by Bernie Sanders had he not, well, we can go into the Bernie Sanders thing
Put
later.
his hand to the plow and look back, as they say. Right?
But I guess what I was going to say in response to also I was going to enter in. I noticed on ZNet, which I don't really look at that much these days. But they still have some Chomsky stuff on there, and they have a guy who usually interviews Chomsky. I don't know how to pronounce his name, Polychranu or whatever. And he has an interview there with Chomsky, a co-interview with Chomsky, and a good economist based in Britain named Ha-Jun Chang.
Yes.
And that's and what Chomsky has been arguing lately is that what he's been pointing out lately is that while the GDP and wealth share of the United States certainly has been falling from half to less than a quarter since World War II, that the wealth of U.S.-based multinational corporations still is half of global wealth. So, and he does emphasize that in this context that sort of makes the notion of the nation state less important in global politics, which is back to a kind of perhaps theoretical, analytical point that I've been making for the last few years on this program, as I've referred to the work of Leo Panitch and Sam Gindin in their work, The Making of Global Capitalism. They have, and I haven't read much of what they've written lately in the last year or so, perhaps. I don't know if they have written much in the last year or so, but I haven't really noticed much of anything. But Leo Panitch has always argued that we still very much have to focus on the nature of the nation state, especially the U.S. nation state, especially its financial system, its control over the global finance. We have to really think about what these relationships, we talk about war, we talk about all the things we customarily talk about. There's a finance aspect to all of this, okay? And it's kind of hard to relate those sometimes. We tend to talk about them in very separate ways, but it all comes down, well, maybe not all of it, but a lot of it comes down to what you referred to earlier, is that in '71, Bretton Woods took us off the gold standard, but it didn't take the US dollar off of the global currency standard, okay? The US dollar, our elites still want to maintain the US dollar as the currency, the go-to currency, the currency which everybody trusts and they put their money in. That gives our banking system, our finance system, and everything related to that enormous global power. So the question to unravel is how that plays out in relation to oil as a resource, which really, as many people often point out, undermines the global economy. Whatever the dollar is worth depends on oil. It depends on oil flowing and the price of oil and who controls that oil, as we constantly stress on this program and on the other AWARE related program. So these are complex issues, and I don't know, back to the first point, that it still isn't about the nation state. However, you've got the euro, you've got the euro market, eurozone. You've got the what is it called? What am I going whatever UK whatever Brexit was all about? UK's member in the European
Union.
European Union, right?
European Union.
I kept
yes,
thinking
exactly.
common market.
Stuck
back in the
there's
1960s.
Several overlapping institutions there,
right.
so it is an issue.
Right.
Yeah.
But still, it's about our military, which is more than half of all the military on Earth. It's about our dollar, which is the currency. It's about our multinational corporations, which control half of global wealth, and how that diminishes the role of our state and our deep state. I'm not quite sure. How that. I mean, I understand they're defending their interests in various ways, but. This is still going down pretty much in terms of U.S. elites doing what they've done since World War II.
I think that's exactly right. And I must say that our way of talking about that seems to me these days increasingly confused by our holding on to an old left-right language. We talk about, is Macron on the left? Is Corbyn on the right? Or is he a leftist as well? What about Le Pen? She's the extreme right, exactly? No. I think those terms, left and right, have become more confusing than helpful. in describing the positions of individual parties and politicians. And they bury the sort of concerns that you were just describing, David, about economy and political power. I mean, remember, the notion that left and right are the fundamental divisions in politics, and the first thing to be said about any politician is whether he or she is on the left or the right. I think that's simply false. That's a fantasy. That's a self-serving fantasy of those people who want to defend a certain vision of society, a vision of economic and political society over which the U.S. has presided since the Second World War. Look where those terms come from, left and right. They're based on the seating arrangements of the French National Assembly in 1793. What happened was those who thought the revolution should proceed further in the direction of democracy sat on the left side of the hall, stage left, I'm told, by the way, not the way we normally talk about it today. The people who were pressing for a greater democratic polity in France at the end of the 18th century, before the appearance of the Corsican usurper, that the people who were pressing for democracy were sat on the left side of the hall, and the people who said, no, we simply have to establish some sort of constitutional limits on the monarchy and maintain the monarchy, the authoritarian right, as we might say, the authoritarians, as we might say today, they sat on the right of the hall. And so we had a division, a bit of language, based upon these particular political circumstances, which indeed were represented elsewhere as well, the circumstances, I mean. But the idea that left meant more democratic and right meant more authoritarian issued out of the 18th century and ran through the 19th century. It's not much use when we come, say, to the Bolshevik Revolution 100 years ago. To refer to Lenin as on the left, intelligent people such as Rosa Luxemburg understood at the time was nonsense. The Leninist view, the Bolshevik view, in fact depended upon a defeat of the democratic forces that had been unleashed by the Russian Revolution. The Bolshevik Revolution, as all came eventually to recognize, was authoritarian. And so, according to the old language, should be on the right. Lenin was a right Marxist, according to that language, not a left Marxist at all. Well, unfortunately, the left came to mean the communists, Marxist-Leninists understood as communists, and the language was corrupted at the base, and is absolutely useless these days, but has a great deal of sort of predictive effect. The failure of what we've been calling the populist forces to get together in France depended upon the popular notion in France that the extreme left, Mélenchon's people, couldn't work with the extreme rights, who after all were fascists. Well, none of that seems to be true, but a lot of it was bought by the French electorate, as a very good article recently by Diana Johnstone on the Counterpunch website pointed out. But what it means, I think, is that we've got to start over again when we try to summarize political positions and not just say, oh yes, Corbyn's a leftist or Trump is a rightist. Doesn't work.
Yeah, I mean, what the sort of vernacular meanings of these things has come in this sort of degraded way of understanding these things. That the left still believe in government or big government, and which Bill Clinton himself gave up, declared the age of big government is over in the 1990s, while he was still fighting his wars and so on and so forth. He meant that what he meant at the time was he wanted to get rid of welfare and at the same time ramp up the national security state and the prison incarceration state. But that aside, it's used. The whole debate has been degraded in the mainstream media by identifying the left with big government in some generic sense, while ignoring the anti-war left, and that somehow the conservatives or the right supposedly opposes big government, when in fact they use government to regulate things in a way that make them richer and to fight their wars. And then on the right, when some genuinely populist forces arise that want to use government, that may be even pro labor union or anti-war, then they're just consigned to their populists, their religious fanatics, or whatever they are. There really just isn't any effort to sort of program by program understand what it might mean, how people might fall on these issues, and really, I think probably one of the best ways of looking at it, or one way to start looking at it, was say who's neoliberal and who's not, and what does not neoliberal mean among the various groups, or its evil twin neoconservative. What does it mean to not be neo in any meaningful sense of that word, in terms again of challenging all of the sacred tenets of all these categories that Thomas Friedman and Thomas Edsel and these people are using in terms of globalization, technology, all of these ways of misunderstanding what our choices really are, because ultimately people have choices. We're not being driven by anything. This is what the interview with Ha-Joon Chang and Noam Chomsky was about this morning in ZNet. What is globalization? How long has it been going on? Is it anything new? What makes it different now? And what are the choices that we have, whether as populations or as nations or nation states, in terms of how we deal with this? And the questions have to be centered around, I think, the concept of neoliberalism. We can debate over it, but I think it's a solid one in describing what has happened in the last 40 years to our both to our domestic and foreign policy. And it has to do, again, you got to understand finance and the role of financialization in that. You've got to understand militarism and war. You've got to understand austerity and government not being, cutting back government programs that actually help people, not austerity when it comes to the military, especially in this country. And you've got to understand that the privatization of government services, and just this idea, again, this fundamental idea that we're here to get, that we're broke, we don't have any money. That is
nonsense.
Is a horrible misunderstanding.
Right. Exactly.
In a country which, again, creates its own currency, or issues its own currency.
And we're hearing it again in the healthcare debate.
Yes, right. Yes, there isn't enough money to fund single-payer healthcare, which, again, is getting back to one of the positive notes of the last few weeks. We'll see. We'll keep an eye on what's going on out in California and what might happen there, or what might be the effect of that. But it's so hard to get through the weeds and understanding what it's actually going to cost.
I've been suggesting that part of our problem with talking about politics in America today is a non-innocent corruption of language, an attempt to mislead people about what's happening by seizing the language and using it in illegitimate ways. I suggested that even the classic terms left and right are subject to this phenomenon. But let me take up the one that you mentioned here, David, in neoliberalism, and suggest that the beginnings of wisdom about neoliberalism is to understand it's essentially synonymous with globalization. If we understand globalization is not just the brilliant fairy tale we've been told for a generation now, that the world is being knit together economically for everyone's benefit, Globalization, in fact, means the control of American, primarily, corporations of the economy of the United States and of the rest of the world, not for the benefit of those who are exploited by the economy, either at home or abroad, but precisely for those corporations that have done so remarkably well in the 40 years you're talking about. We have in the last 40 years seen an absolutely astonishing increase in inequality in America, and an increase in inequality that is accelerating through the 40 years. It's not only getting worse, it's getting worse faster. And that increase in inequality led to the flip side of that was the immiseration of the American populace, and a good bit of the world populace as well, in those 40 years, so that by the time the last presidential election came around, America had many voters who understood that their life circumstances would never have the opportunities that their parents had had, and their children looked like being even less, whereby, or at the same time, the wealthy in America were doing very well, thank you, and indeed increasing remarkably their share of the national wealth ever since the 2008 crisis, particularly. Okay, given that situation, given the notion that the globalization that defined the American economy over the last 40 years was essentially the same as what we've meant from other roots when we speak of neoliberalism, we can understand that some of the people who saw what was going on were associated with the Trump campaign. The Trump campaign opposed corporate globalization, the first presidential campaign to oppose globalization in that way, to speak out against it in 40 years. That's the reason for the attack on NAFTA, for the attack on the Trans-Pacific Partnership that came out of the Trump campaign. Over against that, they posed a frankly more democratic, lowercase d, reform of the economy that would try to restore some of the economic possibilities that had been lost, the economic possibilities of an earlier generation that had been lost. Wages in America have been essentially flat since 1973. The Trump campaign saw that, and when it spoke of making America great again, it was clear that they were not talking about the foreign policy fantasies that we've had, particularly since John Kennedy. They were talking about the economic circumstances, the possibilities, the life chances of the majority of Americans. Now, this, of course, is what the Democrats had to condemn as racism or several other things in order to avoid the obvious point that the Trump campaign was attacking neoliberalism/globalization in the name of the American majority. And a good number of Americans responded to that, enough at least to make Donald Trump president. Now, the horrible denouement of the story is that they didn't have the courage of their convictions, or at least don't seem to yet, in office. They spoke of economic nationalism, and they were condemned as racist or exclusionists or something of that sort. But what they meant was that opposition to neoliberalism, globalization, that would restore the economic chances of most Americans. That's what made Trump president. And that's what the political establishment has been desperate to undermine in the Trump administration, and they seem to have succeeded.
And when you look at, for instance, the immigration issue, purely in terms of identity politics, you say, oh, we have to support the right, but the rights of immigrants in this country, which we do. But the point, to be honest about it, what you have to explain, what you have to understand, is that the American working class has been put by neoliberal globalization in competition with people around the world, whether they're still where they live, making stuff, or whether they've come to this country doing the work. That, and you can argue that it's work Americans won't do. That's a complicated issue, but it's the working class that's put in competition with people in other countries, and it's the professional class that has protected itself from competition with people from other countries, and that makes for very bad politics and understanding what it is that's upsetting people, and how to really to name neoliberalism and challenge it and move beyond to some sort of sensible politics. And I have not, to get back to, it's just, again, this notion of white rage or whatever it is, these just aren't ways to understand how to take the next step in challenging what neoliberalism has been doing for the past 40 years.
And it brings us back to the question of why those refugees there in the first place.
Right.
And does the American worldwide war making of the last 40 years have something to do with it?
Yeah.
That's really not something we talk about much in this
No.
country. We do try to talk about it here at News from Neptune. You have been watching News from Neptune for the 25th week of 2017, a dirty laundry list edition, and we've barely got through the pile. Presented by Carl Estabrook and David Green, produced and directed by Jason Liggett and Dan Pano, with thanks to Dr. No, J.B. Nicholson, for research. Inshallah, we'll be back next week with a new edition of News from Neptune to remind you, in the words of Edward de Vere, what's past is prologue, what to come, and yours and my discharge. In the meantime, confusion to our enemies, and a good night to you.